Good.
Excellent. So with that, let me first welcome everyone and welcome the lots of mini-me's. It feels like a strange movie, and I hope that we'll be able to get that sorted shortly. You don't need to log out. All you need to do is to rename yourselves. You click in the little things next to your ID and make sure that you are logged on as yourself. We're excited that a lot of people have joined, and this is a session on competitive advantage and an uneven playing field in the world of AI and ecosystems. I'm Michael Jacobides. Many of you on your screens also think that you're Michael Jacobides. I hope that you will correct that fatal mistake. I can't, because I can't change my identity. However, I can say hello and welcome, and perhaps pass the baton before I take over with the introduction to my gracious co-hostess. There's only one of her, for sure, Annabelle Gawer. So Annabelle, perhaps you want to say hello, and then I'll take it over for a few minutes, and then
of course
hand that back to you.
Of course, and thank you very much, Michael. Thank you everyone for joining this exciting PDW, this virtual PDW. Thank you very much for the strategy division at the Academy of Management for organizing this event. We are very privileged to have a very distinguished set of senior scholars who are going to be active contributors to this session. Michael will give you more detail about the sequence of events in this PDW and the agenda. But I just want to extend a personal thank you to Professor Carliss Baldwin, to Martin Reeves from BCG, to Martin Kriener, to Colleen Cunningham, to Ioannis, and Marshall Van Alstyne, as well as Feng Xu. And we're going to be speaking about what I think is one of the most important issues facing society today, which is the collusion of different forces having to do with technological change, increasing dominance of a very small number of central actors who are reshaping the nature of competition, as well as the nature of innovation in the context of ecosystems and platforms. And as strategy scholars and innovation scholars, it's incumbent upon us to address these questions head on. And we're very privileged to have had a very great number of submissions, which we will discuss. So please, Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much. And so let me now start sharing my screen. And for the people, hang on a minute, for the people who are joining, share screen. And here we go. Let me share here a little bit. And let me get a little bit of an introduction in terms of what it is that we're doing in terms of this PDW. So the first thing is to say that I guess that we're dealing with a change in the way that activities are organized. And I like starting this session with this image from the Great Hall of the Guildhall, because I think that that represents the way economies were organized, and they were organized by well-delineated guilds, which were societies that were responsible for particular areas that needed to be given some privileges, and that on the basis of these privileges, they could make some money. Well, actually what happened is that over time, we said, well, hang on a minute, we understand that we can organize society in such rigid ways, whether we call them guilds, whether we call them castes, whichever we call them, that delineate what activities are. But what if we stop doing it, because that has led to a lot of rent seeking? And interestingly, there were people that were thinking about competition that were absolutely instrumental in changing these guilds. So I think that it is very relevant that we're now speaking about that, because it was the exclusion of others and the reduction of competition that led to the pushing back of the guilds themselves. So what we had after the guilds started crumbling, we started saying, well, we can try to do the same things in different ways. And I think that my best example on that is that in the City of London, one of the bodies that is responsible for regulation, the Financial Conduct Authority in the United Kingdom, has something that is called the Regulatory Sandbox. And you now have a number of authorities that have sandboxes, like The sandboxes we have for the children to play, not to hurt each other. And if you told someone that this is the way we will be organized with sandboxes so that they can all try out new things, people would have thought that you're absolutely bonkers. But that's what is happening today. And I think that, in my parlance, we have some architectures of sectors that are changing, very rapidly, and people are trying to alter the way that they're put together. Now, what is making this more exciting, and what attracted me at least to think about ecosystems, is that as I was looking at sectors and as I was looking at the architectures that were changing, I started noticing more and more these platforms and the ecosystems that sit on top of them that are playing an important role. And I guess that's what led to the work on platforms and ecosystems, whereas the traditional tools of regulation were looking still at well-delineated markets, and they were trying to say, well, do we have any welfare loss problems as a result of the concentration that leads to oligopoly, that leads to welfare loss? Welfare loss criterion is still dominant in the United States. And then you can start doing all your wonderful comparative statics and perhaps a dollop of dynamics, but that wasn't quite enough, because we could see that you had a crumbling of the boundaries of different sectors. Now, what people have started saying is, hurrah, I know what the answer to that is. The platform economics, and the fact that in platforms, because we don't quite have only sectors, we also now have platforms. The more these platforms grow, the more the value grows to the users. I'm not going to go through that. Anyone who's here probably understands the exponential value that platforms have. And the idea is that the bigger you get, the more valuable you get, which is right, but only partly right, because many of these arrangements that we see don't have direct network externalities. And to go back to one of the pieces of work that I co-authored with Martin Reeves, if you start looking at the different platforms and ecosystems, not only do you see some that don't work, but others that win it all, but temporarily, and others that win it all and see some of their dominance be smashed, so that the standard prediction of, it's the traditional stuff, other than in network markets where everything gets into corner solutions and it's a big mess, isn't quite right. Now, I should also speak about the intellectual base of part of this PDW. This has led to the community of regulators that have been thinking about these issues and start focusing on platforms and ecosystems. And in February, we had a workshop in London Business School, co-organized with the World Economic Forum and UCL, and with my friend and co-author, Ioannis Lianos, who is a professor at UCL and the chairman of the Greek Competition Commission, one of our panelists today. We organized a workshop, both privately for some of the key regulators in Europe and people in industry as well, to try to think about what were these topics. And I think that it was this workshop that suggested that we need to rethink some issues that are around us. So let me tell you what these issues are, I think. Let me also give you a bit of an introduction to what we're going to do. Now, I would like to see what kind of reactions we're going to have. How many of you know this firm? Do we have a yes or no? Or do we don't have, you probably can only clap, so fine. We're not going to be able to poll here. But possibly a number of you, hopefully most of you, know who Ant Financial is. If you don't know, Ant Financial is a subsidiary of the Alibaba Group. It is the most valuable fintech now. It's over $100 million worth. It was worth $1 billion worth. It was worth 60 billion when it went to get its first private funding. And the question is, why on earth was it so valuable? Well, it was valuable because it was able to leverage its own position as a firm, and then not only use the platform that it had, but build an ecosystem of an ever encroaching set of activities. What did it do? Well, Ali, the different platforms based in Ali, including Taobao, there's got B2C, there's B2B, the sort of different platforms, each with its own name in the Ali family, required some way of ensuring that there is prompt settlement, and it offered that. Now, once it offered the payment with an escrow system that worked in China because people didn't trust that they could engage, and it helped broker as a neutral platform. After it did that, then they said, well, hang on a minute. Now that we have everyone's data, why did we start offering them more stuff? We caught them so we can create other things around us. And when they went to get money, they had 150 million people in wealth management. They had 3 million SME loans, nearly 400 million insurance clients, and so on and so forth. Now that, of course, is a bit of a problem, but it also raises some interesting questions about regulations. It raises the problem of scope. Are we okay with firms that start building ecosystems of connected activities that are offering stuff to everyone? The second is the problem of artificial intelligence as a general purpose technology. Why? Because I use all the information that I have to figure out what it is that you're doing, and then I leverage it in all kinds of markets downstream. Now, are we okay with it? Perhaps we are, perhaps we're not, because we think that it favors disproportionately a particular type of firms. There's also the question of data, something that Europeans love to fret about, and interestingly, something that is very likely going to bring Europe in the core, in the center of the regulatory debate, because Europeans first don't have many of these platforms, so they can be as nasty to them as they want, because they don't have any policy capture, which is the problem in the other countries that have these platforms, because they're a little too cozy and too friendly with the government and with the academics that work for them. Also because Europeans are a little concerned about data and the way data is actually used, and they're like, well, hang on a minute, we need to now think about that. And currently, there are two major pieces of potential regulation, the Data Act and the Data Services Act, that will play themselves out in Europe over the next few months, and that for the first time will shape what business models are allowed to do and not. And also we have the problem of M&A and ecosystems. What do I mean? A couple of different things. Let's separate them out. Item number one, when we speak about ecosystems, and it's worth remembering that Ant Financial in its IPO had the word ecosystem 160 times, more than any other, including business models. When we think about ecosystems, we can think about first-party ecosystems, i.e. things that I do myself, and third-party ecosystems, i.e. things that I do with other firms that come and connect with me. Now, the first-party ecosystem already raises some interesting questions, and the questions there are some questions of dominance. So let me show you a different slide, and this is a slide based on some joint work with BCG, looking at the different types of arrangements that you can see Ant Financial do in different areas, apps and services, IoT, retail banking, and you can see everything from minority and majority investment to alliances, to multiple party alliances. So behind what you see, behind all these fund platforms and ecosystems is a heck of a lot of corporate strategy where firms are trying to figure out, what exactly should I do? What is the direction that I should go? And the question is, well, should we be worried about that? There's a second angle, and the second angle to me is equally fascinating. We have this question of regulating or thinking about whether we're going to have a control for an M&A, because a firm may grow and will allow it to grow. The regulators can't do much about that unless they can prove that they're doing unfair practices. But if you're going to do an M&A, the regulator might say, no, 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 that's not good. It's going to be anti-competitive. Ecosystems may be somewhere in between. So you may not be concerned just with the fact that there is an ecosystem, but the ecosystem is growing, but not necessarily growing organically. So there is a different intellectual basis to starting to think about whether you want to have ecosystems that are regulated. And the final thing is behavioral. And I'm sure that this image is entirely alien to you. I'm still struggling to have the norms of interaction of mobile phones when it comes to my spouse late at night. But the problem is that this behavior leads to some firms to become the bottleneck. Some firms that are able to find the right position and be the gatekeeper or bottleneck or orchestrator, or call it what you wish, and leveraging their position and leveraging the energy of others, be able to take disproportionate amount of profit, And the typical example here is comparing a firm like Gawer with nearly 500,000 people working for it that has fewer profits than Booking.com with 5.8 8,000 people. And I think that for me, a lovely quote on that is a quote which I got from Google the day Dick Thaler got the Nobel Prize in Economics, now nearly 3 years ago. And I looked for the first two quotes, and the quotes that I got the day on his announcement was the combination of loss aversion and mindless choosing implies that if an option is designated default, it'll attract a large market share. Basically, we're lazy buggers. And the second is that the choice architect has the responsibility for organizing the context in which people make decisions, which means that there are some firms that do that for us, which then are able to profit disproportionately. What does that mean? It means that these firms that have these positions may be able to have more power than meets the eye, which means that we may want to think about the fact that they do stuff. And then you start looking at these ecosystems and you look at these business and corporate levels of analysis, and you're like, blimey, whether it is a first party or third party ecosystem, we see that there is a heck of a lot of expansion, and we have a concentration which at a global level, with some local heroes, certainly in China, but also in Russia, and perhaps increasingly in other countries as well, we are playing a different role, and a role that we need to consider. So these are the questions that we need to think about. And what is it that we need to rethink in terms of regulation? The first challenge for me is, what is a relevant arena of competition? Is it the firm, is it the platform, or is it the ecosystem? Or all of the above? Usually it is the firm within a market. And I think that one of the challenges that we have, and Ioannis Lianos will probably speak about the struggle that we're having now with drafting the new competition law in Greece, is to convince lawyers that we need to move beyond just looking at the market, but thinking about ecosystems themselves. But how should we regulate them? Should we think about their governance? Should we think about imposing some rules in the way the decisions are made, in not allowing some practices such as having differential use of information, of blocking particular people in the way they work, of those that stop the APIs, requesting open connectivity, suggesting that we change the norms of behavior? And then there's pragmatic questions. Who should monitor and assess, and who should be the recourse of such arrangements? And if platforms and ecosystems are becoming mini economies as we see them going, how far do we want to go? What is the appropriate way of thinking about it? And I think that this is rather deep. There's a paper that I was just reading that was out, an EU Vox article a short while ago, which was titled, for the first time, and that's where I think our community should take heart, of why economists must understand business models. Now that, guys, is new. I have not heard so far economists said, oh my God, we need to listen to what managing people are doing. It's our one opportunity to inform about how the world is working and create a better connection and a better link, which is exactly why I'm fascinated to help create part of this discussion and helping us think, both economists and business studies people and people in regulation, which is why we've got people from all persuasions here to think about the problem we're trying to solve, and to think about the way that we can sort that out. We need to think about how we address that, both in terms of platforms and ecosystems, and also about how these dynamics are amplified by the growth of predictive analytics, computational statistics, call it what you want. Artificial intelligence is much fancier, although it really is the same thing. But it is creating models out of data that are predictive, that can be tested out of sample, and that can be the basis upon which you will be successful or not successful. So you need to start asking yourselves about what affects dominance that way, and also questions relating to killer acquisition. The bottom line, I think, is that we have new tools that we need to consider, the way we look at data for competition, the way we think about issues that people didn't care about, like APIs or the ecosystem governance. We may need a new metrics, and for sure we need a new governance. And I think that there is now a willingness of the regulatory community to engage with us. And there is a responsibility that we have to do research that is relevant not only for firms to make a buck, but also for society to operate in a way that is more sensible and to inform the debate that is going on. What will we be doing in this particular PDW? Well, we're a little late just because we were trying to sort out the gazillion people that inadvertently had my name. Apologies for that again. But we will have panelist presentations and a break, and then panel presentations again, and then we will delve deep into a case study, and then we'll have the breakout groups where we will allocate you randomly on the 7 terrific papers that we got that do focus on some of these issues. Now, first, we'll hear from Carliss Baldwin, who has done some landmark work in thinking about what is at the foundation of many of these issues that we're looking at, which is the way that the economy is structured and the growth of modularity that underpin much of this transition towards a platform and ecosystem-based economy. Then from my colleague, Colleen Cunningham, who's done some fascinating work on killer acquisitions that's gotten quite a bit of press, and although that had started from a different pharmaceutical context, think more broadly about the area of technology. And then Ioannis Lianos, who is the author of the BRICS Digital Competition Report and many books on competition and digital, and also now a practitioner who is working to finish the new law on competition in Greece, and member of the College of Competition Commissioners of the European Union, that, as I was saying, is at the cutting edge. Quick break, and then we'll hear from Marshall van Alstyne, who not only has worked on platforms with some noted papers and books, but also has now turned his interest into how do we think about regulating it, and Feng Zhu, who has done some fascinating work in terms of not only the strategies of some platform firms, but also what that means for society, before hearing from Martin Reeves, who is the chairman of the Bruce Henderson Institute, and who has also done some fascinating work on ecosystems and the way that they evolve, who can give us the corporate perspective, some plenary Q&A, and then the case study on mobile ecosystems will be from Martin Kriener, who used to be the chairman of the industry body that essentially is the grouping of telco producers, and has been an advisor to a number of major telco players. And again, a few thoughts from Ioannis Lianos on that before the breakout rooms. So lots to do. Let me get out of the way. Let me cede the floor, stopping to share to Carliss, and thank you all for being here. Carliss, the floor is yours. Hopefully you can start sharing. Thanks for being here. And before we do so, I was about to forget, we need to have a group photo. So what do we do? Bilgeham, tell us what we do before we start with Carliss.
Just a quick, screenshot I'm going to take. So if you might open your cameras and look into the camera, smile, and just say hi. I can just take a print screen.
There's a lot of us. Say hi and wave.
Hi. Great. I think I got it. Let me.
Terrific. Thank you very much.
Have it. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Carliss. The floor is yours. Thank you very much all for being here.
I'm gonna try to share my screen. Here I go. Share screen. Share. Thanks. Continue. Okay, can you all see my screen? Yes?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, tyranny of algorithms is going to be my topic of today. So let's face it, the uneven playing field is simply a nice word for monopoly. And we should be concerned about the various successful and attempted monopolies that are taking over our world. Oh dear. Okay, so today I'm going to apply the theory of complementarity to explain how digital exchange platforms become monopolies. That's my task. In 9 minutes or less, so I will go fast. Slides are available by request. Context is digital exchange platforms. These, in my taxonomy, which is close but not identical to Cusimano, Gawer, and Yoffe, what they call transaction platforms, I divide into transaction platforms that are actually centered around transactions, and communication platforms that are centered around messages sent and received. So those are two types of digital exchange platforms. Things are being exchanged on the platform. Digital means automated processes based on algorithms. So definitions: complementarity, as many of you know from reading Jacobides, Sinamo, and Gawer. Strong complements defined by Hart and Moore. Both A and B are needed to create any value. Each is totally worthless without the other. That's like right and left shoes. Supermodular, but not strong. This is from Milgram and Roberts. A and B have separate values greater than 0. A makes B more valuable and vice versa, so super additive. And an example would be a nice sweater and pants. They go together and they look nice together, but they're each independently valuable. Theory: strong complements should be created and owned by a single firm to avoid holdup and defensive investments. And supermodular but not strong complements may be created and owned by a diverse cluster of autonomous agents, in other words, an ecosystem. This is the argument put forward by Jacobides, Sinamo, and Gawer. However, this is my point, strong complementarity can be created. It's not a God-given of nature. It's often a human artifact, and it can be used to protect a monopoly. This is especially easy to do with code. Let me give you some examples from ancient history. Microsoft, way back when, combined the web browser with its Windows operating system. It claimed each was essential to the functioning of the other. That was disputed, but never disproved. Intel combined the chipset and internal buses with the 80x86 instruction set. By 1998, they had 81% of the chipset market by virtue of that. I think Marshall would call it an envelopment. The core processes of a digital exchange platforms are a set of algorithms. So you need search and ad placement algorithms. You need dynamic pricing algorithms for either products or ads, and you need data analysis and protection algorithms. And it's in this area that AI, machine learning, A/B experiments, all the tools of predictive analytics work. But I'm going to put those aside for the moment, just know that that's where they fold in. All exchange platforms have to do these three things extremely fast. In the time that your screen refreshes, they do all of these things. And bottlenecks can arise anywhere in this process that's being run automatically on their servers. So this is a quote from a Google engineer of long ago. Your site is slow. What's the resource being constrained? Because it's always a bottleneck. This is not the same use of the term bottleneck that we are now adopting in strategy. It's a production bottleneck, and it is very much the concern of these digital exchange platforms to make their flow processes work. So they need all parts. Any part can slow down the rest. slowing down anything is very, very bad for customer experience. And so these are all strong complements as noted by the arrows. What if you try to buy one piece from someone else? Well, if you're one of the digital exchange platforms, you don't do that, but the rest of us would be prepared to pay off. About usually 30% off the top is the going rate for outsourcing these services. We have Google AdSense as a case in point. Amazon Marketplace is another case in point. The Apple Store and the Google Play Store are also cases in point where they're basically providing some of these services for other people and taking a cut off the top. So code that works is a huge barrier to entry. Now, question is, can you break the code apart? Because we know from past history that if you can modularize a system, then people can enter on modules and turn one big vertically integrated behemoth into an ecosystem of complementary providers. So are the code bases modular? Well, we don't know. It probably differs by company. Pretty certainly Facebook seems to be a lot less modular than Amazon and Google. Google has the most code of anyone, and you couldn't run it. You couldn't maintain it if it weren't modular to some degree. But it frankly doesn't matter. These are the kinds of system sizes we're looking at inside these companies. And at this scale, it's system integration that matters, not modularity per se. So just to show you what has changed, this is a graph, a design structure matrix graph of how modules work together, design rules, also known as standards, modules, and then system integration and testing. Basically, once upon a time, the power was all in the standards. The platform leaders controlled major standards, still true to some extent of iOS. But in these digital exchange platforms, it's the system integration that's grown and become the choke point, if you want, the bottleneck. The glue code, you will never see the glue. I promise you, you never will. Good luck trying to regulate the glue. Thank you for your time and attention.
Terrific, thank you very much. Moving on from the sort of grander conceptual issue of modularity to think about the more specifics probably in terms of the killer acquisitions and controlling your sector through them and what it means for tech. Colleen, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks very much. You can see my slides.
Yep.
Yes, okay, great. Thanks to Michael and Annabelle for organizing this session. I was asked to be on this panel to share my research on killer acquisitions, which is not in the platform or ecosystem space, but then also to provide some thoughts on what that might mean, or what killer acquisitions and the research I've done might mean in the context of tech and digital ecosystems, mainly because it's being applied in that space, and the logic of it is being applied in that space a lot by regulators. So without further ado, let me start. So in the paper Killer Acquisitions, myself and my co-authors, we provide the first theoretical analysis and empirical investigation of this sort of phenomena that we've called killer acquisitions. And the idea is that behind this phenomena is that there may be acquisitions that market incumbents might have incentives to acquire target firms that have nascent inventions or innovations, and then subsequently terminate the target's innovations. And the goal here is to preempt any future possible competition. In the paper, we build a theoretical model to generate testable predictions about how and when firms will buy other firms to shut them down or to shut their technologies down. We suggest that firms are most likely to engage in this when the threat, the sort of cannibalization threat that comes from this potential entrant is particularly large. And so when will this be quite large? First, it'll be the case if the entrepreneurial or the target project overlaps with an existing product of the incumbent. And in drugs, we identify this. So our setting is in the pharmaceutical space, and we identify this as being in the same therapeutic class and having the same mechanism of action as the incumbent. Further, for overlapping projects, cannibalization threat is going to be especially large when existing competition is low, so when the incumbent has a monopoly, or the expectation of future competition remains relatively far off, so their patent on their, or their protection, let's say, on their monopoly in that space, the incumbent's protection is they expect a lot of stream of rents, let's say, from that. We study this using data on drug development, and we generate findings consistent with our theories. So the idea here is that we find significantly lower development of drugs post-acquisition when they're acquired by incumbent firms that have a closely overlapping drug compared to otherwise similar non-acquired drugs, and also compared to otherwise similar drugs that are acquired by firms that don't have this overlapping project or product. And decreased development is focused in markets with lower existing competition, as one would expect, and as well where future competition is far away. So like basically in drugs, that means that they don't expect generics to come anytime soon. We also rule out many alternative explanations for this decreased development, like markets for lemons, optimal project selection, redeployment of human capital and technology, salvage acquisitions, ... the list goes on. The paper's over 100 pages. I'll put a link to it in the chat if you want to see if your favorite alternative explanation is in there. So anyways, overall, what we find is that killer acquisitions exist. And in pharma, we conservatively estimate there are about 5 to 7% of all acquisitions in any given year. Okay. So one finding that has become quite well known from our paper and has had a lot of broad interest, especially from regulators, is we wanted to investigate and see if these types of acquisitions appear to be evading scrutiny by antitrust regulators. So in order to do that, we examined acquisition activity around pre-merger review thresholds. So for those of you who aren't aware, most agencies have some sort of size of transaction thresholds, and if your transaction falls below that threshold, you don't even have to submit for review, basically. So if you're falling below those thresholds, you can kind of just do the transaction. And what we found is that acquisitions that are more suspect for killer acquisitions tend to bunch right below that threshold. So that's the overlapping acquisitions compared to acquisitions that aren't sort of suspect killer acquisitions. And so it appears that this activity is happening under the radar of antitrust regulators, and also that is evading scrutiny. Also, there's been some work relating to ours that suggests that when transactions happen below the thresholds, they're very unlikely to be investigated, and they're almost never going to be blocked, even if they do create a monopoly situation. Why is this relevant for a discussion in tech and digital platforms? As I'm sure all of you are aware, we have these big 5 tech firms that have become dominant over the last 10 years. And at the same time, they've engaged in a lot of acquisition activity. So 10 to 20 deals per year for each of these firms. So when we think about the big 5, very few of those have ever been reviewed, and none of them have been blocked. So you know, it's an open question still of the role of killer acquisitions and potentially other anti-competitive acquisitions in this space. And there's a lot of pressing interest in trying to figure out what to do. So the FTC in the US has launched these, what they're called 6B orders to basically have all of the big 5 in tech submit documentation about all of the transactions that they've done in the past 10 years. And in particular, they're looking for evidence of anti-competitive acquisitions and killer acquisitions. Of course, it's important to note, one thing I want to note is that killer acquisitions are not the only type of anti-competitive behavior they might be looking for. They are sort of the most extreme form of anti-competitive nascent acquisitions, sort of buy it and shut it down. Even when firms acquire nascent competitors and do not completely kill the target's inventions, they still might have anti-competitive effects. So they might buy and delay or shelve the project, including just sort of stopping the ongoing improvement of it, just letting it kind of die a slow death, to take the metaphor and apply it there as well. They may buy something and do what's now been called a reverse killer acquisition, which is shut down their own project and continue the competitor's project that they've acquired. They might also, in the context of acqui-hires and non-competes, buy to stop the generation of a new firm that might become a potential competitor. So there's a lot of, let's say, attention being paid to this space right now. And then just one last thing to say. So there's a lot of interest, I think, in understanding the role of acquisitions in creating and sustaining uneven playing fields in the digital space. And there's not a lot of solid answers yet, I think. At least that's been my impression from talking to different regulators about our project and always having them ask us to speculate about whether or not it applies to tech. For those of you who are interested in studying this, I'd just say that this type of research is very difficult to do in general, and there's going to be it's even more challenging in a tech space for some of the reasons that some of Michael outlined in the beginning. Our research focuses on pharma for methodological reasons. Basically, we can see markets, we can follow projects across owners, we can define competition and study that. Tech doesn't have databases to follow projects across owners. And it's not even clear projects is the right unit of analysis. Markets are harder to define in general, and it's harder to tie a nascent product or service to its end market. So, and also the modes of competition are different. So network competition is a very different structure. The probability of an entrant being successful is probably much lower, but the risks that come with an entrant coming in winner-take-all markets are much more significant. However, there's a lot of interesting wrinkles in this space to study, and I'm sure lots of the other panelists will talk about that as well. So thanks very much. That's it for me.
Terrific. And I think that also tells us that there's a concern, especially for platform markets, where we know that many of the acquisitions, certainly Skype, WhatsApp, were acquisitions to avoid rival. And the question is, do we want to avoid rival? That was quite clear. And right now, if you think about big tech has got in cash about, I'm speaking from Greece right now, about 3 times the GDP of Greece in cash, waiting for acquisitions. And they've said that they would like to make some acquisitions. So that raises some interesting questions. Now, to answer some of these questions, but also to see how people who write in competition law look at these issues, let me invite Ioannis Lianos, and speaking of Greece as well, probably under his hat primarily as a professor of competition law, digital competition law in particular in UCL, but also in his hat as a regulator in the European Union. So Yanni, the floor is yours and you can share your screen.
Thank you very much, Michael. I hope you hear me well. So I will basically speak on my personal capacity here. So the views I will present are only my own and do not engage the Competition Authority, Hellenic Competition Commission. That said, I'll try to share my screen. Let me just see. Sorry for that. Is it visible?
Yep.
So let me just go to the, oops, sorry. I should have started from before, okay. All right, so these are quite interesting times, but also quite stressful times for regulators and competition authorities. And the reason is that we are faced with quite important challenges to our traditional toolkit. So basically, I would say the first one is that what we have seen developing through the fact that now we see quite a lot of competition, not only occurring in the context of product markets, but actually in the context of wider ecosystems. And obviously the role of the data economy is extremely important as a factor that somehow generated this important change to a certain extent, is that what actually we see is that in markets with strong network and learning effects, once new firms are in operation, basically the addition of new competitors does not change the market structure in any significant way. So basically, the competition law enforcement tools, and in particular, the fact of let's say eliminating.
Sorry, Gianni, the sound is coming a bit choppy. If you could put the microphone closer to your, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry for that. So, in certain way, the fact that we have eliminate barriers to entry and to a certain extent enforce competition, but doesn't not necessarily affect the market structure, in particular if a specific market has strong network and learning effects. And obviously, one of the important other challenges that we see, which is somehow a side effect of that, is the rise of concentration that has been documented by many, and in particular the rise of what some have called the superstar firms that command growing market shares and become highly profitable. And this is somehow a combination of various factors, important network effects, learning effects. I think there has to be more emphasis put on learning effects, in particular through the use of algorithms that are proprietary to a certain extent, so that you can see the development of players with entrenched power for a long period of time. And the market configuration we see generally in these markets are that you have a top company that has a very high market share, much higher to the second one, and basically the third and the fourth company do not really make any particular difference to the market structure. And this is not really based on the fact that well, the new platforms are producing necessarily better products or in product markets. You may actually produce a very good product, but if you don't really have a quite interesting ecosystem for the consumer, then even if your product is of better quality, that doesn't really make any particular difference for the consumer, which actually shows the importance of the ecosystem in competition. So for instance, you may have a very good phone, smartphone in terms of technology, but if that specific smartphone doesn't offer the amount of apps that are available, let's say in the Android phones or the Apple phones, basically your smartphone will not necessarily be a very successful contender. So obviously, this is a generalization. It all depends on the level of multi-homing that you see. And obviously, for some services and applications, you can see quite a lot of multi-homing. For others, actually less. And so these are examples from the number of mobile social applications used by Chinese mobile social users. So most of them are using more than 2 apps, quite a significant part actually. More than 5 apps, while actually for other apps, for instance, like search engines, you may see actually less possible multi-homing occurring. So, and that the fact that you cannot change that much inter-ecosystem competition to a certain extent because of these network effects has brought a lot of attention for the regulators to what I would call the intra-ecosystem or vertical competition. So basically, the regulators are increasingly interested in how the surplus value of the value chain ecosystem which is generated is allocated between the various players. So what comes to the fore and explains quite a lot of these new regulatory initiatives are not, strictly speaking, economic efficiency considerations, but actually, I would say, more distributed justice, fairness considerations with regard to the allocation of the surplus value of the ecosystem. In particular, in view also of the geopolitical implications that most of the major platforms are not actually based in some of the jurisdictions that are really trying to regulate, basically, in particular, this area. And we see quite a lot of different tools basically being put forward. So obviously competition law and antitrust law is one of them. But I would say, and we'll obviously open up the discussion later, the telecom industry, net neutrality, compulsory licensing type of legislation in the context, in particular, of standard essential patents, the 5G. These are obviously taking increasingly important role. Now, to make things even more complex and to show how the tools of the existing competition law authorities are probably not fit for purpose, one of the aspects that we have seen and haven't really taken that much into account is financialization. Is basically the importance of financial markets in the valuation of these companies. And most of these companies, the market valuation of these companies is not basically based on is based really on expected returns in the future, on the basis of the positioning of these companies as some would have called mega utilities or important bottlenecks in a specific ecosystem. So, and to a certain extent, this is a concern for antitrust authorities who do not necessarily have in their mind frame, don't really take into account the importance of financial markets, as probably they should. One of the examples is, for instance, in the way actually how markets react, is how Google's stock value increased rather than decreased after the Commission imposed a 1.5 billion euros fine to Google in the AdSense case, while the day actually the fine was imposed, which was actually much higher than I would say people have expected on March 20th. I mean, we've seen basically a rise of the stock of Google, which shows probably, that the antitrust law is not necessarily making any specific, doesn't necessarily have any specific deterrent effect, if that really is what's happening. Another issue which I think is also increasingly important for competition lawmakers, and it's also very difficult to assess, is the importance of the ad-based model, basically, for ecosystems like Facebook and Google. And that's what explains also the focus of some competition authorities like the UK Competition and Markets Authority on online advertising markets, with a report that was issued a month ago, where basically the important thing there is human attention. That's basically the scarcity rather than anything else. And we have very limited, attention span as humans, and obviously what is quite important for the players in these markets is to attract the attention, obviously, of the consumer. So a lot of competition scholars are speaking about attention markets, where we will be able to assess the power of the various attention platforms or prediction platforms, according to some. This really brings forward the need for a new, probably, conceptualization of power in the context of a more complex economy. In competition law, we are mostly focusing on from a neoclassical price theory perspective on the ability to raise prices profitably and market power, the way actually it is usually defined by IO economists. But we see that this type of conceptualization of power might not be sufficient. There have been some suggestions already, in particular in official reports. In a report prepared for the German government, a number of academics have put forward this idea of intermediation power, basically saying that this is not really covered by our existing tools of assessing power. And they define that as the ability to steer information consumers to certain offers and thereby to affect and possibly restrain competition. Although they coined the term, they haven't really provided a metric of how to assess that. Jason Furman, in his report for the Competition and Markets Authority, put forward this idea of strategic market status, which is a sort of a different concept than the classic concept of market power in antitrust. But we are still, finding out about the way probably that this concept will be operationalized in the UK. And I think that if we really try to think about, the various dimensions of power we have here, we need to move away from the resource dependency theories that have somehow influenced our thinking about power so far, based on market share or bottleneck power, to a more positional power type of indicators. What I call Panopticon power, being at the center of a specific network, the power to set the agenda, and this is very important in particular in the context of personalization, and what Michael calls and Annabelle architectural advantage, so being in a position to influence the industry in the way it's structured, organized, the value allocation between the industry and ecosystem actors, which is very important if you are trying basically to do more than just promote economic efficiency, and you also try to take into account fairness and distributed justice considerations, as probably do increasingly so, I think, competition authorities. So the European Commission has started a process of rethinking, and basically what they say is that there are two possible problems of competition problems that are not really assessed with the current framework. So they call the first one the structural risks for competition, and they say that these are scenarios where you have certain market characteristics, network scale effects, lack of multi-homing and lock-in effects, there's increasing risk of tipping, and then structural lack of competition scenarios where the market is not really working well and delivers poor outcomes. And these refer to issues of oligopolistic interdependence and OLD in the competition law and economics literature, but also more recent stuff like algorithms facilitating tacit collusion, and also high concentration, entry barriers, and consumer lock-in, in particular for data. So they say these are problems that with the current tools we cannot really deal with. And basically, what do they suggest? So, firstly, actually, the tools that we have is ex post competition law. So in Europe is Article 102, in the US, the Sherman Act, Section 2 of the Sherman Act. But this focuses on dominance on a product market. So it doesn't really take into account dominance in the context of an ecosystem. Certain European countries, France and Germany including, they actually have a concept of abuse of economic dependence, which has been basically used very recently by the French Competition Authority against Apple, and they basically imposed a 1.1 billion euros fine to Apple, basically using this concept, not finding that Apple was dominant in a product market, but basically, on the basis of the relational power that Apple had vis-a-vis their contractors. Colleen mentioned before ex-ante approaches, that merger control. I mean, this is obviously an important issue. There's a lot of question about the possible gap there because we're focusing on turnover, but as Colleen mentioned before, this doesn't really take into account the value of the deal. So two countries, Austria and Germany, have changed their merger legislation to take into account in the thresholds that generate a competition assessment the value of the deal. And then, we have a number of a potpourri, I would say, of various approaches. The most recent one is the semi-soft regulation through the regulation 2019-1150, which is basically known as the platform to business regulation, which basically focuses mostly on either mediation or collective actions by a number of organizations in courts for a certain number of possible abuses or possible practices that are prohibited by this regulation. However, this was not considered as being enough and sufficient for the problem, so the Commission most recently has come forward with two proposals. So first, the ex-ante regulation for digital platforms, a form of a more hard form of regulation for certain platforms where certain types of practices will be prohibited or subject to control. And this is a proposal by DG Connect. And then the competition authority, the DG Comp, basically the competition part of the Commission, came up with the so-called new competition tool. And what is that? Is basically a form of regulatory antitrust, because it enables the Commission to impose remedies in the context of a sector of the economy, as something that already exists actually in some other countries in Europe, like the UK, market investigation services, also Greece, by the way, Article 11. So these, I think there's a lot of debate about these various approaches. What we have been thinking at the Law Commission in Greece is an ex post tool for dominance in ecosystems of paramount importance. So it's actually, we prefer to use an ex post approach rather than an ex ante approach. We're in a small jurisdiction, and I think an ex post approach makes more sense, as we will intervene against specific types of practices that could be connected with our consumers, the consumers in Greece. And the difficulty there, and this is something we've been working on with Michael, is how to determine what is actually dominance in an ecosystem, the context of an ecosystem. What are the metrics actually we need to use? That said, I would say the problems that are raised are quite broad, and you may actually have very different types of tools that could also be possibly used. Existing tools or new tools. First, if we have some form of natural monopoly occurring, and there's a lot of debate about that in the context, in particular, of a book that will come out very recently in a series that I'm editing. And this is basically calling for a pervasive utility style regulation in this context. There's a lot of initiatives about soft regulation via codes of conduct that has been, for instance, the proposal in Japan. There was actually a group that has put forward this proposal, as well as the UK. I mean, the Furman report also puts forward this option. Then, we are trying to deal with the problem of attention markets by possibly providing property rights. I mean, creating basically the missing data markets and establishing property rights for these fictitious commodities of data or attention that could be traded in markets. I mean, that could possibly, deal with some of the problems, although will not deal with the problem of the asymmetry of power between the individual consumer and the platforms, in case the platform is actually dominant in the specific functionality. And also, most recently, there's been a speech by Commissioner Vestager, who actually put forward some views in favor of introducing the possibility of collective bargaining for freelancers. So basically the Uber drivers, the artists that are working for Netflix that right now cannot, because they are not really employees, they cannot actually form unions because that will be considered as a cartel. And now actually there's a lot of discussion, following a lot of my work as well in favor of that a few years ago, to basically create the possibility for these freelancers and users to collectively bargain with the platforms as a form of countervailing power. And finally, we see the emergence of what I call a polycentric competition, also the fact that competition is also taking into account some non-traditional concerns like privacy. And I refer here to the German Bundeskartellamt, the German Competition Authority decision in the Facebook case, which has been recently confirmed by the German Supreme Court in terms of the interim order. So here we see a quite fascinating new somehow environment where a lot of innovation, legislative and regulatory innovation may happen, and obviously we look forward to your insights as business scholars to help us actually think about the future. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Yanni. And I think that this is a very good place for us to take a very quick break, although we're running over simply because it's super exciting stuff. In order to, I think that what I would keep away from that is, the first thing is that this is an area of some real intense focus right now, and that perhaps for whatever historical reasons Europe is taking the charge, and there is a lot of activity, that there is an interest in changing the way that we conceive of both what power is and how we should be able to redress it. And I think that this is where this community can actually help. We will start our session in literally 5 minutes. We want to give you the possibility for a quick stretch break, but in 5 minutes we'll start, and we're going to hear from two scholars who have worked on the platform side of things, Annabelle Gawer and Marshall van Alstyne, and then someone who's done some terrific empirical applied work in that field as well, Feng Shu, before we go to Martin Kriener to give the perspective from someone who works with business leaders more than with governments in thinking about what succeeds and what doesn't, and can think about the implications of the rules there. We will try to have Q&A, but I'll have to ask everyone to try to condense their insights. Let me please ask you for now, let's say a 4-minute break, and we'll be back after that. So let's take 4, stretch, and see you in a bit.
Michael, one quick question. Are you collecting slides? The last several decks were wonderful, and I'd love to see them.
We will be asking everyone if they could send their slides, and send them to all participants, provided that they're happy to share. So I hope that the answer is yes, but it depends on you guys.
Okay, thanks.
Cool stuff. Thank you.
See you in 4.
It was 4 and counting, 3 minutes. And you're quick to go back to the lineup, I'm telling you. Cracking the whip. Annabelle, are you ready? You're still muted.
Yes, I'm ready.
Excellent. Now you are unmuted. I think that I am going to crack the whip, and what I'd like to do is have you continue on. We've heard some of the conceptual stuff, and it'll be great to start with you, then go to Marshall, and then go to Frank.
Great.
So,
great. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much, Michael, and great pleasure to be here. For the next 7 minutes or so, remarks having to do with the platform's power and responsibility. How did we go in such a short time from darling mavericks with Zuckerberg Person of the Year in Time magazine to evil ogres? And there is some work that I've done recently in a recent book published with Mike Cosumano and David Yoffe called The Business of Platforms, where we look at how companies can build platforms that devote a whole chapter to the question of what we call platforms are double-edged swords. And building on the presentations earlier, I think what we see, especially in a digitally enabled economy, is that value is created in a fundamentally different way. And the complementarities that I've talked about with Michael and Carmelo Cenamo, and building a lot on the work of Carliss Baldwin, I think what digital does is that it facilitates searching for complementarities and exploiting complementarities. And therefore, the process of value creation is fundamentally changed. And what we see is this new organizational form, these ecosystems, which cut across traditional industry barriers, where central actors can have a disproportionate role into capturing the value that is created, yes, thanks to them, but also thanks to many others. So focusing on digital platforms' abuse of power, we can see that a few dominant platforms have accrued an enormous amount of power over their ecosystem members, and that includes users as well as business partners. A few online platforms have achieved centrality and dominance, and as they have done so, society is increasingly asking them to act responsibly and fairly. We see different instances of abuse in a variety of areas, not only in competition and antitrust and platform to business relationships, but also in labor laws, in tax avoidance, in avoidance of sector regulation. So when you have companies that says, oh, I'm not a hospitality company, I'm just a technology platform, or I'm not a transport company or a taxi company, I'm just a technology platform. And then we have other infringements in other areas that are regulated, such as IP and copyright. So when you have copyrighted content from music producers, which is put on YouTube, and then they don't get any royalty, who gets to decide what's allowed and what's not? And then obviously we breach into free speech, censorship, and expression of rights. So what you see here is that there is a huge amount of possible kinds of abuses, and then we see different kind of regulatory approaches. And one of my collaborators earlier said there is a spectrum between laissez-faire, let's just leave things as they are and let's trust in the market that's going to sort it all out, or there is on the other extreme a view that says let's just break them up. They're big, they're evil, they just have too much power, everybody depends on them, we should just treat them as utility. To complicate the matter, we have those, what Carliss called communication platforms, which is a kind of exchange of information where we're asking more and more the Twitters, the Facebooks of the world to govern activities on their platform. And while obviously we need them to take some amount of responsibility as to what's going on, and everybody seems to agree that, you know, pornography, hate speech, and inciting to terrorism is not right, on the other hand, isn't it recognizing their power and possibly accrue their power even more to give them and to give solely to them the right to govern that content? So the question would be, what are the right new institutional arrangement, or possibly even new institutions that can tackle these issues? Because beyond the economic power, what we have here are new instances of political power. in the book with Michael and David, we have identified different kinds of platforms, innovation platform and transaction platforms. But what we can see here is that not all platforms are alike, not all ecosystems are alike. And so a big important piece of work right now in regulatory circle is to try to identify the boundary conditions of those firms that should be subjected to specific rules. So there are rules, for example, about acquisition. There used to be a threshold about how big is the acquisition. There are rules about when should you be asked or forced to share your data and to whom. What is the threshold of importance that we're talking about? There's been antitrust looking at dominance, but the word dominance was very well defined in a context of a market, and that was measured in terms of the extra price that monopolists would charge. But how that translates into platform markets where platforms will always cross-subsidize between different sides, and you could have price at zero or even negative pricing, is something that is complicated. So we all understand that there are new forms of abuses. What we don't all understand and what we don't all agree, because there are lots of very divergent incentives at play, is how to sort it out. Some claim regulatory avoidance has been central to platforms' ability to generate profit, either because they systematically categorize their workers as contractors, therefore not having to pay their insurance, their social security, or taking any kind of responsibility toward their workers. Some others are having proven to avoid sectoral regulation. There's been also these other issues about privacy, online harm, and fraud. There is new regulation into place, but there is divergence in geographical regions, whether it's China, Europe, or the United States, as to what is the role of government into circumscribing the activities of firms. So, and another question is, to which degree are governments actually able to enforce legislation, assuming that they can go on and change the legislation? There are two approaches into legislation. One is going to be, an ex-ante reshaping of the regulation. Another one is going to be, let's just use the existing regulations, such as existing antitrust. So as management scholars, we can also ask ourselves, is this the end of traditional firms? As you have more and more exchange platforms that are outsourcing, we know about outsourcing, but the digitalization and the ability to control and monitor the work of people is radically changing the boundaries of the firm. Also, we have increasingly platforms that don't own the assets. So is this the end of traditional firm? And what of what we call now algorithmic management, or some, such as Shoshana Zuboff, called surveillance capitalism? Are we going toward a world where everyone's going to be a contractor, no salaried employee? Thinking back about Chandler, the modern corporation as we know it, he considered that as a side effect of the Industrial Revolution, or maybe not a side effect, but a consequence. So with the digital revolution, is the unit of value creation and value capture be something of a fundamentally different nature? And what of the responsibility toward workers? So given the dominance and the centrality of a few digital platforms, how should they behave, and what should regulators do? This is my last slide. For sure, the mood has changed. Platforms will need to adapt as users will choose alternative platforms, and regulators will pounce. Have they become de facto essential facilities? Should they be regulated as utilities, or should they even be broken up? I personally don't think so. There's a big but. They certainly should be regulated because there are abuses. Should data be treated as common good? Will firms be forced to open up access to personal data, which they gather, and share it as an open resource? It's important to understand that different kinds of data, the volunteer data, observed data, inferred data, it might be important to break down into these different categories. How should those kind of data be shared? And it's very complicated to understand how little bits of data can be aggregated and then disaggregated to be opened up. So which kind of interoperability and which kind of portability for which kind of data, I think, is the right way to go. The UK Treasury has an interesting idea about identity portability, allowing you not only to access your data, but your connections data. So just to finish, we will see not only new strategies from firm, but I think we will see a new kind of collaborations between firms, regulatory agencies, and representative of social society. There is certainly an emergence of new forms of control, but I think we're going to see the emergence of a new form of accountability. And I think this is why all the work we're collectively doing here is really useful, and it's really good to see we have over 200 participants, the interest that it generates. Thanks very much.
Terrific, thank you very much. And I think that my hope is that we will move from the principles and the need to sort of shift that, if you could stop sharing your screen, Annabelle,
of course,
onto the question of the specific answers. So let me try to see whether I can ask Marshall to rise to the challenge and to move us from the fact that, hey, we need to reframe part of these questions to what should be the principles with which we do them, and what is good or bad news. Marshall, the floor is yours.
Can you see the screen okay?
Yeah, and if you put 76 slides, we will all have left for quite some while. So I hope
promise you it's 9.
Excellent.
There's a whole bunch of hidden ones off the back end from a different presentation. So we'll go to.
Good.
Is that better?
It is terrific. Thank you very much.
Okay, so there's only about 8 or 9 of them. What I want to start with, I want to thank Annabelle for raising what I think is probably one of the most important questions, is that what are the institutional arrangements that we're going to actually have to consider in the regulation of platforms? What is that? Is it going to be a marketplace? Is it going to be self-regulation? Is it going to be governance? I think I can provide a few answers to that, but in order to do so, I want to start with the very first question that Michael posed for all of us, which is what is it that's driving the concentration? Why is this the case? And we can see if we can go over some of the different mechanisms that are causing it. Just to give you some different evidence of what's happening, it's kind of fun. If you take a look at this one, since the rise of COVID, this is a graphic from the Financial Times, the big firms have actually done better than average. If you look at the traditional firms, finance, energy, and institutional structures, or things like infrastructure, such as ExxonMobil or Boeing, they've actually lost substantial value. But if you take a look at the platform firms, and this is just the increment, this is how much they have grown in value. I think Bezos alone has grown by more than 10 billion in net worth since COVID arose, and since we've actually been conducting more of the business online. One of the things I think is essential in this, again, is network effect to drive a lot of this. Many of you have seen some of the other work that we've looked at. We describe platforms as inverted firms. By that we mean, as network effects have grown substantially, you shift from vertical organization where the firm does the production function to the orchestration, or as Michael calls it, ecosystems. Ecosystems is such a powerful element, but it's third-party partners that are creating the value. If you look at the chart here comparing, for example, Uber to BMW, or particularly nice is Facebook versus Walt Disney. BMW and Walt Disney make their own stuff, whether it's cars or whether it's content. Uber, third parties do it, or in Facebook, you and I create the content. What's fascinating is that Facebook is worth almost 20 times, in terms of the ratio of market cap to number of employees, it's almost a ratio of 20 times. We would argue part of this is because the ecosystem is creating the value rather than outside. So what's the scaling element of that? What's driving that? And what are the implications for that? Well, all of you are familiar with the standard stuff. So it's not much time for this audience really worth spending much time on it. But the first is the connectivity network effects. And then of course, in addition to connectivity network effects, there are the two-sided network effects. One of the things that we looked at in some very recent research is to take a look at the intertemporal effects. So are these necessary and are they sufficient? So in a separate model, we've actually started to look at the intertemporality of the network effect. So if you take a look at the size, even in the two-sided markets of merchants and consumers in the previous period, how many of them stick around into the next period? Can you use them as predictors of the value in the next period? And of course, that can be carried out through time. And you also, of course, want to analyze the competitive effect. So we actually took some data for Groupon and we took Living Social as a comparative firm. And if you look at the prices and the consumers on the other side, so maybe if prices are better on Living Social, folks will attrit, or maybe if there are more users on Living Social, then people will jump from, the merchants will jump from Groupon over to Living Social. So you can also look at that. And of course, you have to look at those effects on both sides of the market. And what we found is actually kind of interesting. You can have really strong simultaneous network effects. So in this case, what we found is that merchants do attract consumers and so consumers attract merchants, but they don't stick around. In Groupon's case, what you wind up happening is typically they'll consummate the match, but then they'll go do the deal with the merchant directly. So once you've presented the coupon, next time you'll order your pizza or you'll get your hair done or you'll get your oil change directly with the merchant as opposed to going offered. So the strong network effects within period don't necessarily persist into the next period. This is one of the arguments is often loose. So network effects can do it. It doesn't always guarantee that it's going to happen. One of the issues is that Groupon has not been good at using its information to create stickiness. So now we ask the question, particularly others have raised wonderful questions about artificial intelligence, or Colleen was talking about information for new drugs or things of that sort. So when does information lead to stickiness or growth? Well, the next question we need to ask then is, can information lead to market concentration? And under a lot of the standard models, the traditional assumption for this is that under Bayesian signal updating, the answer is generally no. The result is so strong, you can actually prove this under conditions of concavity. You're either going to add sufficient news to it, and as you aggregate all the signals, ex post, a single signal can be equivalent to the sum of all the previous signals that came before. It doesn't even matter if you have different populations. So maybe you're disambiguating men versus women, or maybe you're disambiguating people in Texas versus California versus New York. In any case, you get convergence in there. I want to give credit to Hong Ho, who asked a question in the background. What about learning effects? Varian likes to call these learning effects. And I want to argue that's true, but the reason he wants to do this, of course, he wants to protect Google from antitrust legislation. And this is a very strong model, and the implication is that an entrant could come in late in this kind of a condition and still perhaps control the market, because you get concavity in the growth under these models with information or learning effects in there. But that's not the full story. That's only one model. This is one of the reasons I love theory together with application. All these models are only as good as your assumptions. And within the assumptions of this model, of course this is true. You're going to guarantee this, but let's modify the model to add other states, and I'll give you two other information models. The first of these models is information as computation. Many of you will recognize this as computability theory. The second of these models is information as input to production. That gives us endogenous growth theory. And in the first instance, basically what you've got is information on the states of the machine and the number of different elements of the tape that are computable. The aha insight from that is that the space of computable strings is so large, even the set of all languages on it is not even countable. It's so big that it's not even infinite, it's super infinite. If you take a look at the endogenous growth theory, it's also kind of interesting. The aha moment there is that if information is input to production and output, the fact that it's non-rival and you're not using it up the way you would steel or concrete means that even a concave production function gives you convex growth. So you get this increasing returns to scale. So what's then interesting is that whether you treat information as news, or whether you treat information as computation, it turns out you can get information with exponential growth. So you have to just look at the assumptions of the model. I did some work ages ago. No one cites this stuff. It's an ancient paper. It was a PhD thesis. It actually shows that all of these models are equivalent. And what you need if you want to convert one model to the other is the ability to add new states. So if you can add the new states of combination and you compute new things on top of it, then in effect, it's like being able to extend the elements on your Turing machine tape. But it has really interesting implications then. What do we do? In this case, you can get convex growth, which gives you a very different result than what Varian and others might want you to believe. So that brings us then to antitrust. So the new titans, what's actually happening there? What kinds of interventions would we want to introduce under these circumstances? So I want to take the most basic framework. So we're going to ask the simple question, is it a good idea to break up? And so if we take a look at the convex growth under Metcalfe's law, it's the simplest possible formula. So I was trying to get to this point whether information or network effects, either of these two properties, can bring you to convex growth. If that's the case, does it ever make sense to break up a firm like Facebook into Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp? And if that's the case, the basic answer is no. It's dirt simple. In some cases, what you really want to do is, so if you split it into 3 firms and then you grow it in proportion to the square, then you're going to get 1/9, but then you get 3 firms back, so you're only going to get 1/3 of the value. So breakup doesn't create value. Again, if we have inverted firms, users can't create value for one another if they're on different platforms. They have to be on the same platform. So we need this idea of an inverted firm, and we need the idea of increasing returns to see why it's a bad idea that breakup doesn't make sense. This then brings us to other questions, things that Colleen and others raised about terms of the information as a product, information value that you can create for other parties. If it's the case that we can then open up the data, suppose that we use something analogous to PSD2, which is the Payment Services Directive requiring open banking in Europe. In that case, you're allowing third parties in to the ecosystem. Then you are opening up the data, and then you can get, notice, n plus m quantity squared. You get this added term in the middle, 2nm. It's bigger than before. Of course, this is a better policy. You need the mechanisms to actually open up the data and treat data as a more regular resource. So the insights, again, are whether it's network effects or whether it's information. On those conditions where we get convex growth or where it's been designed into the ecosystem, you get a very different organizational structural form, which leads us to different kinds of interventions. So it's really a body of information work and how you actually then want to cause more information to be created over time. So I've summarized a huge amount of stuff, but for those of you interested, there's some of the runs that are more relevant in this. One is this proposal for valuing information instrumental goods that most folks don't even think about because that's a pure theory paper. And more recently, we've been working on digital platforms and antitrust. What are the regulatory interventions to do this the right way? I would be in agreement with antitrust and with others, Jacobides and others. Breakup's not a good idea in this context, but gaining access to the data under the right terms will allow third parties to create value in ways that actually will grow ecosystems as a whole. And then it's a question of who gets that value. It's a very different way of looking at the problem.
Terrific. Thank you very much. And let me now very quickly shift to Feng and see whether we can drill down even more. So Feng, the floor is yours. And I know that you've looked at some of the competitive dynamics and the policies of particular firms, from Amazon to a number of others. So what did we think first about the competition dynamics, and then hopefully conclude on the how should we think about regulation, which is the high level. Floor is yours. Thanks very much for being here. We can see the screen, but we can't hear you.
Yes, sorry, I was muted. Thank you so much, Michael, and thanks so much, Annabelle, for organizing this session and for having me here. So it's a great pleasure to continue the conversation about the platforms. So it turns out that in the digital world, even though we think that this is an uneven field between digital and the non-digital companies, platform and non-platform companies, it turns out that there is lots of performance differences within platforms as well, right? So if you look at the platform markets today, we have so many different examples, right, ranging from Uber, Airbnb to Upwork, Kia.com. But then if you zoom in and look at their performance, you will find that not all platforms are equally successful, at least, right? So if you look at the valuation of these platforms, I use data from the beginning of this year to avoid this COVID confounding effect, right? So Uber around that time was valued about $15 billion, but as we know, Uber in the past few years has been losing billions each year. And Airbnb was valued about $38 billion, but Airbnb turns out was actually profitable in 2017 and 2018. And it suffered some losses in 2019 because of its acquisition and the marketing cost in preparation for IPO this year. And the TaskRabbit, right, which is also having this kind of sharing economy flavor, was only valued at around $120 million. Later on, it was acquired by IKEA. And the Groupon, right, I mean, it used to be extremely popular at its IPO about 10 years ago, valued at $13 billion, but today it's only valued around $1.3 billion, 10% of it. So the question is like, why do some platforms manage to thrive, but others don't? Why do some platforms manage to scale up while still kind of having such a hard time capturing any values? So this has been like on my research agenda for a while, and the angle I've been using to approach these issues is through like looking at essentially the network structures. So the idea here is that to grow a platform market, essentially you are going to grow a network. So many of the network properties turns out to have significant influences on platform performance. So in the interest of time, I won't go through like all the network properties. I will focus on these three. Like the first one is the degree of network clustering. So if you compare like different platform networks, you will find that the network structures can be quite different. So on the left side, right, so this is a structure that represents the network of like say Uber, Groupon, TaskRabbits, which are based on mostly local matching essentially. So if you think about like Uber drivers in a city, they probably only care about the number of riders in the same city mostly. And if you are like a rider in a city, you probably also care about the number of drivers in the same city, right? I mean, of course, some of these riders are frequent travelers. They may care about like the number of drivers in other cities, but most of people, right, I mean, care about the situation in their local markets. But the situation is quite different between Uber and Airbnb. For instance, in the case of Airbnb, if you are a traveler, you actually care about all the hosts outside your own city, because you're traveling to other cities. And if you are the host, you probably care about the travelers coming out from different cities, not like within the same city, because they're unlikely to stay in a different property, right? The same is true like for Booking.com, eBay, which are mostly based on this global matching, right? So when you have a very kind of a clustered network, right, just like Uber, Groupon, then it's actually very difficult for you to leverage network effects to protect yourself from a potential entrance, in the sense that your global network size is somewhat irrelevant to your local network, right? People like, so a new potential entrant can actually concentrate on its effort, right, in a local network to put up a reasonable fight with the incumbent. Versus if you're a company like Airbnb, right? I mean, once you manage to scale up, and then it will be very difficult for entrant to come in, because in order to kind of compete, the entrant would have to scale both sides of the network simultaneously and on a global scale. Right. So this actually explains a little bit of a defensibility across different platforms. And the second kind of network property I want to highlight is this idea of multi-homing, in the sense that the two sides can be affiliated with multiple platforms at the same time, right? So in some cases, multi-homing takes place on one side of the market mostly. Like for instance, if you look at iOS, Android, most of the consumers use like either iOS or Android phones, but many of the app developers are multi-homing. Then if you look at like food delivery platforms, typically like restaurants and also eaters, they are all kind of a multi-homing across multiple apps. So in one research I've done, and we actually found that kind of when you have two-sided multi-homing, it's actually exceedingly difficult for a platform to dominate the market because of some kind of dynamics, interdependence across the two sides. So we look at this setting where like a Groupon was competing with Living Social before they got merged. So basically before Groupon's IPO, so Groupon made one change to its deal counter. So instead of showing the exact deal, which is on the left picture, exact deal that was bought by consumers, Groupon decided to only show basically a rough idea of how many deals got bought. The idea is that many analysts, right, try to use like a Groupon's information to infer essentially Groupon's financial situation at that time, and the Groupon was not very happy with it. So Groupon basically made it explicit that the deal counter would read that over a certain number of deals has been bought, and instead of showing the actual number of Groupons purchased, the company would actually display an imprecise count that has been reduced by a random percentage. So even though it says over 50 bought, you have no idea whether it's like actually 470 or 520. So, but the Groupon's action could have a significant impact on Living Social, because Living Social at that time must be watching like a Groupon's deal counter to figure out which deal is going to sell very well, and then try to approach the same merchant for new deal offers and ask them to kind of list their deals on Living Social. So empirically, we did find that after this change, it became difficult for Living Social to copy, because Living Social couldn't figure out which deals would work out well. So Living Social actually copied a few deals from Groupon. But the Living Social also wanted to maintain its deal variety. So Living Social also increased its effort to source new deals. So consequently, the deal variety in this market increased tremendously. But the interesting thing is that we actually observe this effect we refer to as seesaw effect. So the idea is that when you reduce the merchant side multi-homing, essentially the merchants are, most of merchants are now single homing now, right? And it turns out that on the consumer side, the consumers will start multi-homing more, because they now actually want to access both platforms to access these unique deals. So in the end, even though Groupon, by manipulating this information transparency, reduced essentially multi-homing on the merchant side, it actually strengthened essentially multi-homing on the consumer side, which actually make Living Social a stronger player, at least on the consumer side. So the conclusion here is that once you have this kind of a seesaw effect, with multi-homing on both sides, a platform as a result would have to fight on both sides of market to dominate the market, and it becomes essentially more difficult to do so. And another factor we're looking into briefly, and this is together with Grace Gu, who is also in the audience, and is to look at threat of disintermediation. So the idea is that all platforms are intermediaries, And if you're intermediaries, you always kind of need to worry about the potential of disintermediation. And in many online platforms, after the two sides are being matched, and the people would take transactions offline. Later on, For instance, if you try to hire a cleaner, you probably find the cleaner on the platform the first time, but later on you probably would call that same cleaner if the cleaner did a good job the first time, And without using the platform anymore. So Grace and I actually look at this relationship between trust and disintermediation using a randomized control experiment with online freelance marketplace. And so what we discovered is that, okay, most of platforms try to match essentially two groups of strangers, consumers and service providers. So in order to encourage them to kind of essentially have transactions participate in the marketplace, platforms need to do a lot to build this trust through reputation systems, background check, ID verification, sometimes skill tests. But the problem is that if you do all this, and it actually diminishes your value creation in facilitating the transaction. If the customers know that the service provider is so trustworthy, then the customer probably won't care about all the escort service, monitoring progress, resolving disputes, all the services provided by the platform. So as a result, we might see actually more disintermediation. So, so essentially in the kind of experiment, we did find that if you increase the trust between the two sides, you actually see more disintermediation. Maybe this might be problematic for platforms to capture value. So there are also other kind of factors, such as the strength of network effects Marshall talked about, and we also talked about these opportunities for network bridging. And Marco Yancity and I actually summarize some of this framework in this HBR article called Why Some Platforms Thrive and Others Don't. If you're interested, please feel free to kind of get a copy, and or I can send you a copy as well. And this includes a more detailed discussion of all these factors. So thank you so much. I'll end here.
Thanks, Frank. Although I really need to start pushing you guys to deliver a little bit more on the welfare impact, both you and Marshall, rather than the strategy impact. which I think is a little bit more tractable. So the pushback will return in Q&A time, and I will start by asking you a welfare question, because we have not yet looked at it. And I think that this is one of the fundamental issues that we are facing here. What are the welfare implications? Before we go there, and I do want to hear the views of you, especially given that the presentations were a little bit more on what to do in order to succeed. That's not our audience right now. Let me turn to the question of how that looks like from the perspective of organizations. Martin Reeves, you tend to work with companies that navigate this world. And of course, one of the sources of advice is to say, well, let me tell you what you need to do because the world is more complex. Give us a bit of a sense of how this strategy looks like from practice before I turn it back to potentially pushing back on the analysis of what that means for welfare as opposed to individual profit. The floor is yours. You probably are muted because we can't hear you. Yes, Martin, we're still struggling to hear you. Let me see. As we're waiting for Martin to get his microphone ready, Feng, I don't know whether you would have any quick thought in terms of the implications for welfare and mostly for regulation as opposed to the competitive dynamics. And I hope that we're going to get the voice for in a moment for Martin Reeves. But if I can cold call you as I promised that I would, let me try to push more on the what does that mean for competition and competitive dynamics.
Yeah, sure, and happy to talk more about it. It turns out that even though this kind of a framework speaks to kind of companies, but it does have lots of implication for policymakers. In the sense that I mean that basically shows that not all platforms are the same, right? In some platform markets, I mean the entry barrier can be quite low, right? If the platforms have a local network structure with lots of multi-homing, weak network effects, and suffering a lot from disintermediation, right? For such platforms, probably we don't have to worry too much about the regulation because there is a sufficient amount of competition in this market, and consumers or the service providers are actually quite powerful in the sense that they can easily switch to another platform. Sure. They can disintermediate. There is always like a cap on the fee the platform can charge, and because the moment you charge a lot, I'm gonna disintermediate. I'm gonna go somewhere else. So as a result, like we shouldn't worry too much about the market power. But on the other hand, there are factors that would make some platforms like much more powerful, right? Low disintermediation threat, weak multi-homing, strong network effects. Like so in markets like this, then I think regulators need to pay more attention to.
Indeed, and I think that one of the directions that we're trying to take things, and if you look at what's happening in Europe, is to impose both portability and multi-homing, and actually create the fragmentation that you're saying, oops, that's bad for strategy, because that tends to be good for competition. And there are sometimes where we need to think about the trade-offs that exist and what we advocate for society versus what we advocate to firms. Now, in terms of advocating to firms, Martin, let's try your voice level.
Let's try the IT again. Can you hear me this
Perfect.
time?
It's working. It's wonderful. I'm muting myself. Floor's yours. Thank you.
Okay, let's see if we can do this. Okay, so the presumption of the meeting seems to be that there's something called an ecosystem with network effects, and this creates sort of supernormal economies of scale, and this creates competitive abuse, and we need to regulate it. And that's obviously not false, but it's not quite the whole picture, because we we had to happen to be looking at a slice of time rather than the whole period of evolution. If you look over a period of 10 years, at least 85% of ecosystems fail according to our analysis, and less than a third of companies that are investing heavily in AI are making any money. So we do actually need to think about how to help ecosystems compete. And I think this is an important thought. It's not the opposite of thinking about the regulatory question. I think it needs to be thought about in parallel to the regulatory question, because for a number of reasons. Number one, we want to not just limit harm, but we want to maximize value capture. Number two, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We don't want to suppress ecosystems. We may want to do something to certain types of ecosystem. And also, you know, there are more imaginative responses than restriction. You know, one could argue that the European Union needs to create more favorable conditions to compete in ecosystems and artificial intelligence, where it's currently extremely weak. So with that being some sort of justification for saying how can ecosystems compete more effectively, and I will come back to regulation at the end. Traditionally, when we have a new phenomenon like ecosystems or AI, we stick the word strategy onto it, and we talk about ecosystem strategy or AI strategy, and we imagine that we've reinvented strategy. But I think we should always ask, you know, is there anything fundamentally new here, or do we just have a new phenomenon, a new language? I think that there is a new phenomenon in strategy I'd like to talk about that connects with the idea of how can ecosystems compete more effectively. And that is that strategy generally we define on convenient timescales, and timescales of human decision-making, planning. So it might be weeks, it might be a small number of years. But I do see that ecosystems, AI, and their associated social and political consequences are stretching timescales. So obviously, in the much discussed direction of time compression, we now have millisecond algorithmic operations which cannot be controlled or planned directly and are too complex to do so anyway. So we have to think about ways of indirect control or planning for that compression of timescales. But I also think, interestingly, we're seeing a dilation of timescales, because the geopolitical competition in AI, for example, is causing political shifts, which will take probably decades to play out. It's a hegemony between the US and China, primarily, not so much Europe. So we need to think about, and those are very important forces for consumers, for nations, and for companies. So the key problem I wanted to focus on today is how can we, and we meaning companies, but also regulators, strategize on multiple timescales? Undoubtedly, there'll be somebody in the audience that knows more about this than I do. But I do find that my clients are struggling with this problem right now. This is my conceptualization of something that they're struggling with. How do we strategize on multiple timescales? We don't actually have to look at ecosystems to see this problem. So the historian Emanuel Wallerstein talks about historical time, and what he means by historical time is non-linear time. As with this Lenin quote here, Wallerstein says that the density of destiny shaping effects can be concentrated in certain periods of history. And I think we're seeing one right now with COVID, and we're seeing one also with technology and its political and social implications. And so the idea is, and this is not so much an idea as an observation from conversations with clients, that they're really struggling to think about different timescales that have become compressed and overlapping. So clearly with COVID, you need to react. You need to do something to avoid bankruptcy. You need to think about the viability of a supply chain, the security of your workforce. But then we have a recession to deal with, and we have recessionary strategy to think about on slightly longer timescales with more uncertainty. And with recession comes rebound, probably in two flavors, with the removal of social restrictions and with the rebound of economies. So we need to think about that time scale too. And we know that's a very important time scale, because we know that the companies that benefit from recessions benefit from the competitive divergence during the rebound phase. And that's about differential growth. And it's quite different from the cost-oriented earlier recessionary strategies. And then we need to think about returning to a world which is not going to be the same as the one that we departed from, reimagination of the business. So the question is, each of these not only involves a different timescale and an overlapping timescale, but each of them involves a different way of thinking about what the problem is. So how do you do that? So some evidence that I'm talking about something which is not just a theoretical construct. So I've been interested, I couldn't find a data source as to what are companies actually doing during the COVID crisis. We surveyed about 350 multinationals here on their relative allocation of their managerial cognitive capacity to reaction, recession, rebound, and reimagination. And you can see that many companies are thinking about all of these things simultaneously and struggling as to how to conceptualize that. The one which is slightly underrepresented still is reimagination. More immediate concerns are occupying most companies, but at least 30% of companies are now thinking about what will our business look like, what will our business model look like as we exit COVID. Now, we do actually have, of course, some traditional ways of strategizing on multiple timescales. We have discounting, but of course it has some problems. It assumes that everything is quantifiable. It assumes that the optionality, the different paths are of a manageable number, or that we have normally distributed variances in the different variables. NPV is very difficult to fit both reimagination and reaction into. We have hierarchy. You can think about organizational structure as a sort of a bandpass filter, whereby the slow effects go to the top of the organization and the tactical stuff stays with the sales force. But the problem here, of course, is that you can't really modulate those timescales. There's no override mechanism when the short-term stuff becomes the most important stuff, as in a crisis. We have multiple planning cycles. Some companies run a 1 year and a 3 year. Some companies run 3 horizons. But who said it's 3 and who said it's 1 year and 3 years, or 1 year, 3 year and 5 years? And we have separation. We have long-term functions and we have short-term functions, but this, of course, is a very inflexible arrangement.
You unmuted yourself, Martin. You need to, oh, excellent, yes.
Biology needs to deal with multiple timescales, multiple sources of uncertainty, and isn't handicapped by management education or managerial dogma or organizational inertia. And we find indeed a great variety of mechanisms in biology for coping with multiple timescales, multiple sources of uncertainty. And so to pick just 3, the decomposition of timescales in biology is often achieved by multiple overlapping adaptive mechanisms. So if we're cold, the first thing we do is we shiver. It's a cheap reversible response, and we might relocate to somewhere warmer. A slightly more expensive response, we may adjust our physiology, put on fat. A slightly more expensive response, and we may go into genetic adaptation if the environment persists. So we can adjust on multiple timescales, preserving option value in a sort of a cascading fashion. We can apply different methods, different modes of thought, as it were. Not that biology thinks, but we can apply different modes of computation, like R versus case selection for different types of situation. Foraging theory says that the time you spend exploiting versus exploring is an adaptable parameter, and you adjust the parameters of the search equation according to the changing time parameters of the environment. So how would you make some of this practical? So one idea I have is that you can make this practical with what I call a multi-lens approach to strategy. So the idea would be that you take different approaches to conceptualizing the strategy problem, which are each appropriate to a different time scale. And you essentially, therefore, are able to both think about different time scales simultaneously and also in different and complementary ways. So the renewal problem is essentially a survival problem. It's about rapid pragmatic action. The classical strategy is essentially a planning problem, which is essentially very applicable to controlling costs early in a crisis. A recurrence problem, a potential recurrence problem in COVID is an adaptive problem, whereas the longer timescale problems are visionary search problems, entrepreneurial search problems, or collaborative ecosystem sort of problems. So I'm finding this sort of multi-lens approach captures the spirit of, it provides a methodology for conceptualizing strategy on different timescales in a way which is not too complex or theoretical, that appears to be useful. So coming back to regulation, I wonder whether the regulatory debate around ecosystems is actually stuck a little bit during the reaction phase here. Namely, we have some big dominant technological monopolies, and we feel like we should do something about it, and we should, break them up or whatever. But I wonder if we apply a multi-lens approach to this regulatory problem, whether in fact we might see different things. For example, if we apply the reimagination lens, if we say basically, there is an unprecedented opportunity for creativity here and for unprecedented solutions, maybe we start thinking about actually making the EU more conducive to competing in ecosystems, or maybe we think about balancing the economic benefits of ecosystems with the empowerment of the consumer with portable identities, or maybe we think about the distribution of the benefits of ecosystems rather than the prevention of their accumulation. So I'm aware this is a work in progress, a pretty messy thought, but this is a problem I'm struggling with clients right now. How do you strategize on multiple timescales? I see it as being applicable to ecosystems regulation. I'd love any feedback from those of you that have touched upon similar issues. So back to you, Michael.
Excellent. Well, a slightly different way of wrapping it up, a more meta thought in terms of the complexities of the environment and what to do with them. Let me try to pick up the mantle in terms of part of that, this conundrum, and then say, well, part of the problem that we may have is that we are using some tools and analogies that may not necessarily be quite as relevant. And let me try to, in essence, use what we heard from Feng to perhaps challenge part of the orthodoxy. And I guess that I'll direct that partly to Marshall here. The idea, for instance, that there are network effects that are unambiguously rising in the number of nodes appears to be predicated on some extremely strong assumptions that I think have very scant historical basis, i.e. what we see is, rather than saying that everyone cares about everyone else, you care about people who are your proximates. You care about your own social group. That is why you have TikTok that is growing. That is why you don't have the bigger network that adds value. As a matter of fact, you don't want the uncool people. You would rather not have the uncool people close to you at all. And you would like to be in a subgroup that is clearly distinct. And it may look like the second of the examples that we saw from Feng's side, which has some interesting implications. The data that we've found, for instance, like the data that we got on the competition between the different platforms, supports it. So the question that I have at a meta level is whether we found some convenient but statistically not very good in terms of describing, i.e. overly stylized representations that might not help strategy and might not help policy. So for instance, if it is the case that people don't care about the universe, but they care about the connections within their own sort of smaller part, then we would expect that there could be some more potential value that comes from differentiated ecosystems. On the other hand, that also suggests that there are some open competitive questions, i.e. is it the case that we should encourage the fermentation by pushing for data to emerge and to be available, like the European Union did with financial services, so that people need to ask Martin Reeves even more, what the heck do they do with this complexity, where they need to start creating more stuff because they cannot be supported in the existing structures that we get. So let me try to push and then see whether there would be sort of any take up in thinking more creatively on either ways to characterize the competitive dynamics in the world of AI and ecosystems, perhaps even daring to challenge our orthodoxies. And also let me see whether there are any comments by others from the panel. And as I say that, I'll shut up and I'll be looking to the chat function. So let me open up to any of our panelists. for thoughts, reactions, synthetic comments, and anyone who has a question, please put in the chat, and then I'll put it to the right person of the panel. So with this provocative statement, let me have it open and see where it takes us.
So Michael, let me jump in and offer two thoughts on it. First of these is to say, look, any strategy or empirical work will absolutely need to recognize differences in network effects. To give you dirt symbol taxonomy, there's clearly a difference between community connectivity network effects, like the Metcalfe side, you know, or that you get instant messaging or things of that sort, versus say user-generated content network effects that you get on YouTube or TikTok or from artificial intelligence. I mean, your Google search, Michael, makes my search better, and all the other Michael Jacobides on here, even though they're not you. So that the fact that there are those information spillovers or these externalities does create value, but there are of course differences, and they do fade. And I think the venture capitalists have even pointed out in the case of Uber, after you get to a wait time of 5 minutes, you don't care which network you're on. So the strength of network effects tapers even in those strong two-sided cases after you've gotten past some thresholds. So riders don't attract more drivers, and drivers don't attract more after a certain threshold. So they are diminishing returns at some point. Now, in terms of the regulatory question, I think it's important to recognize these are externalities. One of the beautiful things about platforms is that by internalizing externalities, they do a better job than pure markets of just each driver deciding for themselves, or each searcher deciding for themselves, or each YouTube poster deciding for him or herself. So by internalizing externalities, governance models do better than pure markets. But by participating in the revenue capture, they still do worse than social planners. So you might still be able to create more value by sharing that more broadly, as opposed to having the platform capture most of it. So what's happened is that we moved somewhere from pure markets to platform, which is better, but we haven't moved all the way to what might be a social ideal, and in which case social intervention is justified. I would argue that some of the data sharing agreements are some of the best ways to actually do that, to enable third parties to create network effects, and not just the firm itself, not just the platform itself. So third party data access as one of the mechanisms. Then we get to the question, so it's all yours, 1 second. Then we get the question of how you divide it and who gets the value. So all yours, Annabelle.
Yeah, no, I think these are very, very good points. Two complications though. The first one is with data sharing, is that I love the idea of using data as a resource and having it accessed by lots of innovators. But we get into this thorny issue around privacy. There is the existing players already in place. Some of them, Facebook, for example, have shown that they cannot be trusted, even when they promise that they're going to preserve the privacy of users' data. And so any solution that's going to say, we're going to rely a lot on data sharing or data portability is going to have to tackle head-on the trade-off between privacy and sharing. And that's something that I think we need to address. There's no. The second point I'd like to make is that platforms themselves consider that they are a kind of private regulator, right? And in your own work, my work as well, we have understood that role in terms of the governance of the ecosystem as a kind of regulation. So while I applaud the vision of let's keep all the value creation capacity of platforms while trying to think more progressively or more fairly about the distribution of that value, what I'm not clear about is exactly by which institutional mechanism are we going to make that happen, right? So we understand there is,
and this
a lot of
is
data, a lot of, yeah.
And we will look at that, I think,
I'll stop here.
And the problem, unfortunately, everyone having run over from 5 to 15, is that we're running behind. And what I would love to do is to move to the case study, because it is the case study that shows who will do it. And who will do it. It could be either an aggregation of players who is trying to push back, or possibly the regulators, which is the types of issues that Ioannis is going to be speaking about. Let me ask one question that I see 2 or 3 people have raised and open it to someone who hasn't spoken, i.e. anyone other than us 3, saying that, hey, aren't we speaking a little too much with around B2C as opposed to B2B? Isn't B2B different? And I would add, enough already with social networks and telephones and faxes being the example. I think they're atypical. I think they have outlived their purpose. Let's start looking at the world rather than using bees and trees example. But what do you guys think about B2B as opposed to B2C, from especially from anyone who hasn't spoken yet? B2B as opposed to B2C. Frank, perhaps your research, to me, it seems that lends itself to thinking about different types of networks. Have you given any thought about that?
Yes, I guess at the end of the day, we have to think a reputation mechanism a little bit broadly, right? In the sense that, you could develop reputations through, like, for instance, online reviews, which is much studied in the literature, but you could also develop reputations through, like, many other mechanisms, such as certification, such as repeated transactions, right? So in the B2B setting, I would expect that the repeated transactions, kind of organizational relationship can play a stronger role than just the reviews itself. Versus in the B2C settings, like in many cases, it might be like some kind of a one-time matching, right? As a result, the reviews and the word of mouth becomes much more important, right? But at the same time, as I mentioned in my talk, is that they do need to kind of think more about the disintermediation, right? So especially in platform setting where there is an intermediary. And what Grace Gu and I have been advocating is that as we started to kind of increase essentially the reputation kind of mechanisms, try to increase the effort of building trust, and we should also kind of think more about how to mitigate the disintermediation. So there are some strategies we mentioned in our paper and also in my HBR article about, like, how companies can change its business model, right? From like, essentially you capture value differently. Sometimes you don't even capture value from commission to mitigate the disintermediation here.
Well, and we should also remember that many of the platforms are in the business of providing recommendations. Who puts up the recommendations on the top? Or by what reviews say, some other things that the big engines provide, which opens the question how they make. I think GT is now, I will be asking Martin Kriener to come to the stage in just a second. And the reason is the following. One of the challenges that we have, and looking at it both from a corporate strategy side, working with organizations, and from a policy side, working with people who regulate, is that you realize that there's a risk when you look at specific examples, right? Because the examples sometimes are atypical and they are not representative of the broad space. This is the risk that I think we use toy examples that sound nice, but just how relevant are they in broad swathes of the economy? I'm increasingly concerned they're not, and I'm increasingly concerned that we're using some examples that may or may not describe them. Now, in order to make sure that we don't have this problem, what we have asked is to say, fine, let's take one part of economic activity, and that is the mobile ecosystem, and then see how the entire ecosystem is changing, see how these dynamics, the platform dynamics, the ecosystem dynamics, change the way profit is made, change the notion of power, and then see what are the regulatory challenges that emerge. So we have the pleasure of having Martin Kriener, who's been a senior executive and important thought leader in the area of telcos and mobile communications. He's served in senior leadership positions as well as an industry association of the telcos, and has a very good sense of an overview. Martin, the floor is yours, and then we will go to Ioannis to give us the complement of the so what should regulators do and how do they think about it. Floor's yours. Thanks so much.
Excellent. Hopefully you can see the screen there, Michael. Yeah, so I mean, obviously this is a very wide space, and the bit that I kind of zoomed in on is the evolving power, the power of a small number of tech giants. And as Michael mentioned, my industry is the telco industry, and I would consider my view to be global rather than limited into any particular area. So I've picked two very brief case studies, though there's an awful lot more than can be presented in a short period of time here. But really, it's looking at things also that are coming down the line. A lot of the discussion, as was alluded to there is a B2C understanding, and there's been a lot of very good research in this. But when I look at this from a power point of view with the hyperscalers, and I look at their impact on the telco industry, I'm seeing something coming down the line that is going to have major policy implications. We all know, I think Martin Reeves mentioned there about the sort of geopolitical view stretching out, for the next 10, 20, 30 years. So one thing is going to be looking at the telco industry supply side being disrupted by the hyperscalers. The other is looking at the telco operators, so the carriers, and how their digital services ambitions are being dominated by the hyperscalers. And both of these are quite important. They're going to have major implications in my view. Very brief, the way the telco world works at the moment from a network infrastructure point of view, telco networks are proprietary. Everybody's got their own kit, built to standards, but still all a bit different. Delivered, the whole thing is delivered via physical network equipment that sits in the back office of the telco, and they're supplied by the three big traditional vendors, Huawei, Ericsson, and Nokia. That is all moving into an open source software virtualized world in the cloud. It's all going to be delivered via virtual network elements that are hosted in data centers, and that's going to be dominated by the hyperscalers, and all of the management will all be SaaS based, and that's already happening. And it's going to be supplied by a wide ecosystem of players. So rather than just the three big giants you have at the moment, you're going to see this much bigger ecosystem that will include these guys, but it'll also include an awful lot more. And we've spent a lot of time mapping out the ecosystem in terms of who is playing what role over the next maybe 24 months in terms of this ecosystem, rather than what's been happening for the last decade. But if you look at the types of moves that are happening, which the likes of the hyperscaler ramp up focus on the telco market, there's a lot of work around things like Google's Edge Cloud, Google Anthos, which is a whole capability for providing virtualized telco offerings. There's a lot of activity from people like Microsoft with their acquisitions of Metaswitch and Affirmed, as well as the rollout of their Microsoft Azure Edge capability, as well as hosting a whole load of new players in this space, like Mavenir and Parallels and Altiostar. And the interesting thing is the US government is also waded in, because the three big current vendors would be one Chinese and two European. There's no US vendor of network equipment, and so there's a lot of money being pumped into the market in order to try and create a virtualized set of infrastructure offerings that kind of works around, it does a home run around the existing established network equipment vendors. You see a lot of the global software companies playing in this space as well, tying themselves not to the existing vendors, but to the leading hyperscalers. And I won't go through them in any other great detail, we've very little time. But suffice to say, what this slide is saying is that there's a whole load of practical things happening, like Facebook's investment in Reliance Jio, which is not just an investment, but it's one of the major hyperscalers trying to insert themselves deeply into one of the most successful telco markets in the world. And then transporting that outside into other markets. IBM is very heavily invested in this space. So when I say hyperscalers, I'm really talking about, I suppose, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, but there's a bit of Facebook in there, and then there's a bit of the traditional giants like IBM playing in this space as well. And what that is leading us towards is sort of three future scenarios really for where the infrastructure part of the telco world is going. One is, status quo. That is always an option. Status quo has been in place for the last probably 20 years anyway, where you've got a stable set of suppliers. There's continuing digital transformation, which is my area of expertise, gradual piecemeal virtualization of the infrastructure, but under the control of the traditional vendors. And then there's this shift into the cloud native telco, where the telco becomes a cloud native player and it starts shifting everything into the cloud, including its network infrastructure, and it starts broadening out its ecosystem. And then the ultimate conclusion of that is what I call the hyperscale dependent telco, where the hyperscales become so efficient in terms of hosting all of these network functions that essentially the telcos have no option but to leave their network capability with the hyperscalers, and the telcos no longer have a network capability and become pure service players. And this is, at one level you could say, well, let's leave the market do that. But we all know, anybody who's ever looked at read news site or looked at news in the last 2 or 3 years, who owns the telco network is a huge policy issue. It's a huge strategic issue, geopolitical issue. The EU is very sensitive to this. The EU is very sensitive to their infrastructure being provided by the Chinese, but increasingly they're also now going to be hugely sensitive. The infrastructure is controlled by the primarily US-based hyperscalers. So there are major issues surrounding this, and this is almost an unstoppable migration. It's more about how long it will take for this to actually happen. But I'm reasonably certain over the next decade, we will have changed the marketplace significantly, and the telcos will be completely dependent on hyperscalers for their infrastructure. And that is then going to drive, presumably in advance, a whole lot of regulation within the EU on how the EU protects the control of that infrastructure if that cloud is being provided by the big hyperscalers. So that's kind of one thing that's coming down the line. Another thing that's coming down the line is that the telcos, 5G, we all know about 5G, but the return on investment is dependent on generating B2B revenue in vertical markets. It's not going to make its money back on basic connectivity in a B2C world. And we all know about this. Again, this has been covered a lot in the press about how 5G is the big step for the telco world to move from the B2C and basic connectivity to enterprises to really sophisticated interventions and capabilities being plugged into agriculture, cities, manufacturing, healthcare, and so on. The problem, and this, I won't go through this financial analysis, but this is a bottom-up analysis of where the money's going to be in 5G by 2025. It's a big market. Our analysis shows around 4.7 trillion is going to be enabled by 5G. About 1.6 trillion is going to be connectivity based. And about 480 billion of that is going to be new connectivity revenue. And that becomes an issue because the cost of rolling out 5G by 2025 is going to be around $640 billion. So there is a gap between the revenue that's possible and the additional and the cost. And that gap is going to have to be closed by the telcos doing something in one of those vertical markets that I list at the top of the slide. It doesn't break even unless the telco can come up with some new non-connectivity revenue in these vertical markets. And these vertical markets that the telcos are investing heavily in are factory, smart factory, healthcare, drones, smart farm, connected car, smart events. There's a whole range of them, but these would be the ones that are the flavor of the month, at least for the last 12 months. The problem is that each of these is and again, this ties to the geopolitical challenge of you're now moving from not just having a telco infrastructure that is a national asset, but the telco infrastructure is fundamentally enabling all the rest of your economy. And not just from a pure connectivity point of view, but a much more sophisticated, integrated set of capabilities and services being offered into healthcare and factories and agriculture and so on. And for a variety of reasons, and I think Marshall's presentation kind of explained some of the rationale behind this, or maybe the mathematics behind this, but telcos have basically been unable to develop platforms in any of these markets over the last decade. They've invested billions upon billions, I estimate around 10 billion, trying to trial new platforms in these areas, and they've always failed. And they failed primarily because of their geographical limitations, how I describe it, but essentially they can't generate the network effects across enough users, and so the network effects are distributed across 100 different telcos around the world, and so you get this square law reduction in terms of the impact. And so these markets are being hoovered up again by OTT players working with, OTT means over the top, non-telco players who use the telco network, of course, and hyperscalers coming around, again, doing a home run around the telco and dominating these industries. And that is going to be, again, a major policy issue, particularly in Europe, if they find that their smart factory, their healthcare, their agriculture, their connected cars are being driven and controlled primarily by non-European technology. One of the ways around this, and it's an area that I've done a lot of research in, is the idea of collaborative work. And I think Annabelle mentioned about the need of the smaller players to all work together, and the telcos are the smaller players in this space. And so what are how do you structure federated platforms that would work across multiple different telcos across the world to give them the global scale, to give them the network effects that is required in order to, but still give them the level of control that each one of them will require within their own territory. So very quickly, that was a very quick run through two sort of topics that I see coming down the line that are going to be driving a lot of policy decisions, particularly within the EU. So the industry is being disrupted by hyperscalers. The shift to global platforms for communication networks, the control, the operation, and the vertical market digital services are going to generate significant policy challenges in a world that's becoming decreasingly globalized. In a globalized world, I don't think this matters all that much, but as we've all seen, the world is decreasingly globalized. And federated platform business models can help address some of the digital services challenges, but the hyperscale dependent telco is another problem that's going to have to be picked up on.
Terrific. And I think thank you. And that, I think, gives us a wonderful illustration of the kind of world that gives Martin Reeves' clients a headache and the need for some support. But I also think that it shows a couple of things that are really fascinating. One, it shows wholesale change in the industry architecture, and you see that ecosystems that are created on the basis of how the industry is shaping. It's not that just someone out of the blue simply creates them. The second thing that we see is that there was a significant amount of deregulation that has allowed for the tech players to come in, who now have become so powerful that, ironically, we may need competition in order to ensure that they don't quell potential new waves of innovation as they've captured it. The third thing that we see is that there is a significant difference in terms of the capabilities of players. And you saw that the winners in the ecosystems were not the telcos, whom, as you know, Martin, are also different in their capability of understanding the customers and offering all the other services. I will not name particular telcos that have, well, not had, you know, the innovative product at the core of their offering, despite what they think. And this is kind of where the regulation comes in, because what you want to do is that you want a world which may be complicated strategy, but is good for innovation and it's good for new stuff. So let me now turn to Ioannis and ask him if he could tell us a thing or two about that.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. Very interesting, insightful presentation before. Obviously, presentation raised the point of vertical competition happening through this new industry architecture. Basically, hyperscalers like huge companies like Google, Microsoft, Facebook, Alibaba, Amazon. You know, and in particular, I mean, the presenter focused on cloud, on the cloud services sector, as well as over the top, basically telcos somehow coming in and eating more of the surplus value of the traditional, basically, players, the telco operators. And I think, you know, this raises quite interesting point more generally about, you know, the way regulators have come into this sector. Telecom regulation was basically, you know, one of the important insights and new things happening in the 1990s, you know, after the liberalization of the telecom sector in the EU. And what actually I think we're seeing now, and actually not seeing only now, but actually for a couple of decades probably, is a convergence that is happening between the telecommunications value chain with those developed for private and enterprise computing. And to a certain extent, you know, there were two separate value chains, one quite regulated, I mean the telecommunication one, the other one actually not as much regulated, because obviously we had antitrust applying to it only. And now we see somehow a coevolution happening in the worlds of computing and mobile telephony. And obviously, I think this is an interesting element, which this process of convergence obviously will probably become even more pronounced with AI and the Internet of Things, and that may trigger a process of competition and concentration across basically this industrial boundary. So the telecommunication companies, mobile network platforms will enter into competitive clashes with computing platforms, cloud computing platforms, mobile broadband platforms, etc. Each of them competing in order to become the new systems integrator. And obviously, the industrial structure that will emerge will very much result from the way each of these actors will handle APIs, and also, in particular, the process of standardization in order to handle the technical complexity of their interaction. And let me just say here that the process of standardization is actually quite different in the communications industry in comparison to the computing industry. So the telecommunications industry followed traditionally a model of cooperative standardization with the development of industry fora to establish ground rules for global standards. In contrast, the computing industry has followed a de facto standardization approach, which enables some companies whose proprietary technology became popular to have this accepted as an industry standard, which raises obviously the risks of market tipping. And obviously, I would say issues of interoperability will certainly arise in the context of cloud computing platforms. The leading platforms, Google, Apple, Microsoft, offer vertically integrated services to their cloud computing infrastructure. Adding applications contributes to locking users into the platform. And obviously, interoperability will vary from setting harmonized cloud standards and architectures to forcing common interfaces. So the global market for cloud computing, and I put there IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS, is moderately oligopolistic with only a number of large players: Microsoft, Amazon, Salesforce, IBM, Oracle, and ACP, and it's noted there has been a considerable increase in M&As in recent years in this industry, mostly actually involving acquisitions by big tech. There has been more than 130 acquisitions between 1998 and 2018. So the market seems competitive, but there are some firms growing exponentially more quickly than others, particularly markets in Amazon. And to a certain extent, this might probably raise some issues from an antitrust perspective. However, I would like to focus a bit more here on the role of standards. I think standardization will be an extremely important area where, basically the traditional players and the new players will somehow collide. I mean, in particular in the context of the Internet of Things, the different types of standards. You can actually have horizontal standards, which can be of infrastructure type, developed through technical innovations and possibly patent protected. Some of them are governed by standard setting bodies like ETSI or IEEE. Then you have vertical standards for the internet, which are on top of the horizontal infrastructure. And where actually the dominant system leader may decide on certain technical standards being basically open or privileged or private access for interoperability within their respective ecosystems. And you have, product-oriented standards for different data, music, storage solutions, for instance, etc. What I think I mentioned before is that we see a number of traditional standard setting organizations basically struggling to become, to enact basically standards for the new Internet of Things era. There are several pre-standard collaborations consortia that have formed between, including several different combinations of important players for the technologies that might be included in the IoT standards. So, for instance, ETSI or even CEN and CENELEC playing relevance in the Internet of Things paradigm, and obviously we have also special IoT standard setting organizations. For instance, in 2015, the European Commission and various IoT players launched a large-scale alliance called IoT, the Alliance for Internet of Things Innovation, with the aim to assist the European Commission in the innovation standardization policies. Now, whether these collective efforts under standard setting organization will be relevant in a world where Google, Apple, Samsung, and Amazon, and Microsoft, with their own standards, SmartThings, Alexa, IoT editions, and IoT editions, etc., will bring out their own unilateral Internet of Things solution is still to be seen. And obviously, this is going to be a quite important element. Now, in terms of the regulatory framework, obviously, that first raises the issue of jurisdiction. I think, some countries like Mexico and Greece, they have exclude the competition authorities from applying competition law in the telecom sector. I don't think really it makes absolutely any sense in the context of convergence that we are actually seeing. Obviously, I think the competition authorities should look more closely to the gatekeepers in the Internet of Things, and in particular, the cloud providers. What is interesting is that some platform cloud service providers include broad non-assert provisions that prevent their customers from asserting their intellectual property rights against the system leader or any other cloud service customer or partner. And I think obviously there's some advantages with regards to that, but also I think significant probably competition problems, because non-assertion clauses, they might possibly, they're widely used, they might eliminate the incentive to conduct R&D. If the firm knows that it can still not prevent another firm to enter the market. Actually, cloud providers may, with the use of these clauses and that advantage, become more potent competitors to any actually cloud user. And this could possibly be a problem that might require some competition law activity. Obviously, competition law is not the only thing that might apply here. We have regulation of the free flow of non-personal data. that together with the general data protection regulation will obviously regulate the non-personal, basically, aspect of data, while the data protection regulation is more personal data. But this doesn't really, deal with a number of issues. And finally, I would say that there is an effort to expand electronic communications regulation. I mean, there have been some interesting judgments of the Court of Justice in Skype, for instance, where the court basically extended the application of the telecom framework regulation to VoIP. And the new, there's a Gmail case where obviously the court did not require, did not include Gmail as an electronic communication service. That there has been recently the enforcement and implementation, of the new European Electronic Communications Code that takes a broader definition of what is electronic communication service. And I think this could be an interesting development here. And finally, there's the eCall regulation, which could be very interesting, kind of sector-specific regulation concerning the vehicles system for connected cars. So that could be another possibility, developing sector-specific type of regulations to deal with open access concerns in this context, and providing some form of reasonable fee regulations to regulate actually access to infrastructure.
Terrific. And I think that that gives us a sense of what regulation really is. And a couple of quick things. And interestingly, Annabelle, Carmelo Cianamo, and I have a new paper, a sequel to our SMJ, coming out hopefully in research policy soon, where we show the difference between 4G, which is a standard, and 5G, where you have competing ecosystems. One of the things that we see is that standards and standards for the entire industry is a substitute for ecosystems. And you may want, as a policy player, to not have ecosystems, but rather have players that compete via standards. And this is a very interesting distinction, and one that we're going to see. And we were speaking about that in the contrast between platforms and ecosystems. The second thing that I'd like to pick on what Yanni said is that a lot of the effort of society to regulate is now happening not only by regulators, but not only by people like Ioannis, but through the standard setting agencies, which have the power to essentially set the rules of competition and see whether these are going to be advantageous or not, which then raises in also the specter of what should regulators of competition do when they start thinking about the technical standards that have economic consequences. And I think that now we have a retooling of the regulatory community that needs to understand anything from API to standards and what that does to the competitive dynamics. And we really have a shift in terms of what the attention here is. And you now also see the new way that the competitive game is being played. And I think the place where you see these platforms and ecosystems being joined at the hip with these changes in the entire industry architecture and the way that the value is distributed. It is a fascinating topic, and we would be able to speak lots more than that, but boy, are we late, because everyone has been saying interesting stuff. Unfortunately, we'll have to go to the breakout rooms. It's not unfortunately, there are some terrific papers. We will use 20 minutes only, so we'll try to compress the presentation, compress the discussion, and then a quick Q&A. And then for anyone who's crazy enough to stay on, please stay on here for some final, for the final summary of what we said in conclusion, if this platform doesn't boot us out. Bilgehan, if you can send us into breakout rooms in 20 minutes, we will all be excellent. Well, we're all back. And whoever is still alive after this long session, it's been well over the time that we said that we would do. We said, oh, we're going to have some concluding comments. I'm not quite sure that this is what people are looking forward to.
No, I think we should just conclude and thank everybody here,
Absolutely.
Michael.
Hey, it's been good fun. These are thorny questions. We have had a stellar crew, and it is experimental and messy to take Martin Reeves' sort of analogies of the reality they're dealing with, and we're trying to deal with it. So, as you heard, for once, our field is asked to contribute to both regulation and economics. And I think that this is a place where we need to start rising to the occasion and moving beyond the analogies onto the specifics. So the push was based on this. We will try to circulate materials and slides and the rest of it, and hope that this is the beginning, but certainly absolutely not the end of the conversation. I hope that you guys have enjoyed it. It's been fun. It's been messy, and I would like to thank everyone for sticking it out for such a long time. So thank you very much, and
thank you all.
Thank you for being our master technician as well. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
And
a huge thanks to Bilgeham.
Here, we need to be contributing more to the debates. Michael, it was great of you to organize this. It's really wonderful.
Yeah,
Annabelle and Michael,
same thing, Marshall, actually, that the, here's a live, relevant area of strategy, hot area of regulation, headache for companies. I mean, it's great to see strategy being an applied science on an issue like this. It's very, very heartening.
Absolutely. And thank you very much, everyone. It's been fun. We're going to have more of these.
Okay, bye-bye.
Excellent.
Thanks, everyone. Enjoy yourselves wherever you are. Morning, evening, or whatever it is. Cheers.
Bye-bye.